Well, I was first approached about my idea of whether we should build a Japanese garden in the summer of 1963. And the man that approached me was Reverend Yutetsu Kawamura, and he had been thinking about this, and Cleo Mowers had also been thinking about it. And these two ideas came together. And when the two ideas came together, Reverend Kawamura felt, well, maybe his idea should be investigated. And so he was a friend of mine, and and I don't know why he asked me, because I didn't know anything about Japanese gardens, but my response was, well, I don't know anything about Japanese gardens, but let's look into it. Let's think about it. Let's investigate it. And that's where we got going from. There was an ad hoc committee formed, and I wasn't on that ad hoc committee, but I had a friend who was. And we talked about how we should approach it and so on and so forth. And whether we, one of the questions that came up very, very early was, well, should we even build a Japanese garden? Because can we build a Japanese garden that will be our quality, that we'd be happy to have? And we couldn't answer that, And then the next question was, well, how much will it cost? Well, we had no idea. And so these ideas kept surfacing. And then we found out that the government of Canada was funding some centennial projects. And they said, we might be able to get some help from the federal government. And it was the federal, provincial, and municipal governments that had to fund this thing, these projects, you see. And so we said, I wonder if what the committee would think about this. And we approached some people who were on the Centennial Committee in Lethbridge, and he says, oh, we think that's a great idea. Sure, we'll support it. And it went from that committee to City Council. And City Council voted unanimously to look further into it. And they appointed a committee in January of 1964, and it was a citizens committee to look into the planning and actually plan the garden. Now, and I was appointed by the mayor of the day, Frank Schering, to be on that committee. And I forget just exactly how many people were on the committee, but there was about, as I recall, about 8 or 9 people on the committee. And so we got to work. And one of the first things we said was, we don't know anything about designing a garden. We've got to find an architect. And this architect would probably have to come from Japan, because we didn't know of anybody locally who could design it. And we went to the Consul General, and he said, well, I'll help you find somebody. And so he came up with the name of Dr. Tadashi Kubo, who was designing a garden in San Diego. So Mayor Frank Schering says, well, I'll go down to San Diego and ask him if he would come and design the garden. Now, I've since learned that Dr. Kubo had some real reservations about designing a garden in this cold country of Canada. What could grow here, you see? But he says, well, I'll come up and visit you and see. Well, we came up in, I think it's April. We showed him trees, we showed him rocks, we showed him locations. And he took this location, this location here on the west end of Henderson Lake. And I think his mind was made up. This is where the garden is going to be. Because one of the things about a Japanese garden is a borrowed view. And this borrowed view made it so that the garden ends at the lake, Henderson Lake. But the view extends all the way. And so it makes the garden look like it's a huge, huge garden, you see. Wonderful place. Dr. Kubo recognized this as the great potential of it. And even if we didn't, certainly he recognized it. And there was no question in his mind, this is where the garden should go. There's been Japanese gardens in North America since the late 1800s. but there's been a great proliferation of them since this garden was built. The first challenge was finances, of course, but you know, with the Centennial Grant, that was a big help, but it wasn't anywhere near the total going to cover the whole cost. But we were very fortunate in that when the committee was formed, we were a city committee, and we said, this has to be a city garden. The city has to ultimately take responsibility for it. We're building it on city property, and of course the city didn't charge us, you know, for the site or anything like that. They were very pleased to have this site utilized as part of the beautiful Henderson Lake complex here, you see. But the city was ultimately responsible for it. We just were a committee acting on behalf of the city. The opening was on July the 14th, 1967. It was a centennial project, and we had the Prince and Princess Takamatsu from Japan here, and that took a little bit of doing too, because you know, these people just don't travel and jump at every invitation. And after the invitation went, we were finished building the garden in end of May of 1966, full 1 year ahead of the centennial, and we were working on who would we invite to open the garden. And it's quite a thing. We said we'd like to invite the somebody from the imperial household in Japan. We didn't know who. So we went through the consul, and the consul said yes, we'll forward it up the line. And after it got forwarded up the line, I think he made his recommendation. But I think there was either 2 or 3 other people who came from Japan, and they said, they were visiting Lethbridge, and they would certainly like to see the garden. Well, we know quite, not for absolute certainty, but we're quite certain that they were here to come and inspect the garden and make sure that it was of a quality that it would be suitable for the prince and princess to come for the official opening. Well, after we got the garden built and the official opening, then one of the things that I really, really enjoyed was bringing friends here, and especially people from out of town. And one of the things they would come in, and you know, when you come to the garden, the first thing you do is you look at see the aesthetic beauty of it. And until you really get into the garden, you don't see the depth of the garden. And then after a while, after you start seeing the garden, you start to feel it. And the thing that you feel is a calmness within you. And you don't know why, but somehow, for some reason, you feel a calmness in the garden. And I've noticed more recently, in the last few years, you know, that as I step through the gate, all of a sudden, there's a calmness that comes over me. And I didn't know why, but I have been talking to our master gardener, I've been talking to the architect, I've been doing a lot of reading. And this is the essence of the Japanese garden, is to not only prune it so that it looks good, but so that it conveys a feeling of peacefulness to the people who are visiting it. And the way they get this is by the harmony of the various components. And so you look at a tree or look at a rock, you know, and you say, oh, isn't that beautiful? But the total is greater than the sum of the parts. And if there was a tree that hadn't been pruned properly, then you would lose the harmony, you see. And so there's 2 rocks by the entrance, by the Mugo Pine near the entrance. And about 8 years ago, our master gardener says, you know, we should find bigger rocks. Oh, and why is that? Well, you know, the tree has grown but the rocks haven't. There's a lack of balance. And so they moved those 2 rocks and put them in another place in the garden, brought in 2 bigger rocks, and all of a sudden you look at it and you say, yeah, you can see the beauty, you know. It brings back that harmony. And so it's one of those things that until you really, really understand the garden, and I'm not claiming to understand the garden, but I think I can feel the difference. I wouldn't have changed those rocks. Well, when we first built it and all the trees and shrubs were small, well, even the big trees that we brought in some pretty good sized trees, but they've certainly grown and they've matured. And I was here with Cleo Mowers, who was one of the original proposers of the garden. And Cleo and I were talking, we says, you know, won't it be nice to see this garden mature? And Cleo lived long enough to see the garden mature. And so I've seen the garden mature. And I've seen it to the point where we've had to do a lot more pruning, because if you we want to keep the natural look, but still we want to keep the size, and we want to keep it so that you can see some of the branches, you know, and we want to express the greatest beauty of that tree or shrub, and that's what we're after. But at the same time, it has to be pruned so that it's in harmony with the rest of its immediate surroundings and with the rest of the garden. Well, we had some very interesting things during construction, you know. One that really impressed me was all the buildings, the gates, the pavilion, the azumaya, the bridges, the bell, were all built in Japan. And they took them all apart, and then they were going to ship them to us. Well, the law in Japan at that time says you cannot export something until it's paid for. The law in at least Lethbridge was that you cannot pay for something until you receive payment. And we just, well, now what do we do? Well, we had a pretty smart lawyer in our committee, and he says, well, that's no problem. We'll just form a society. And the society will borrow the money from the bank, send it over to them, and then the shipment will be made. Oh, that's a good idea. Went to the bank and they says, yeah, we'll loan you the money. And then the next thing they says, wait a minute, the society doesn't own the property. The city owns the property. So they said, we'll loan you the money, but 5 members of the society will have to co-sign the note so that we'll be responsible as a group or any one individual. Well, I was the vice president, I was the treasurer. So I had to be one of those who signed it. And I says, well, I only got 2 nickels to rub together, you know, but that's all right, you still have to sign it. Okay. So I went down and I signed it. We got the money. We said, well, 5 craftsmen came from Japan to put all the stuff up. And we used to have a little construction shop. And the only person in the construction shack one day was one of the people from Japan. And the rest had gone out to the local jail to get trees. So the phone rings and he answers the phone, and he asked, is Mass there, the architect? No, he's gone to jail. Oh. So then, is so-and-so there? No, he's gone to jail too. And we never did find out who it was that called. But they must have been just thinking, what's going on? I've laughed about that so many times. The 25th anniversary, we says, well, we want to have a celebration of the 25. So again, we says, let's see if we can get somebody from the imperial household in Japan. And so, as it turned out, Prince Takamado and his wife, Princess Takamado, were assigned to come. And He's the nephew of the Prince and Princess Takamatsu who were here for the official opening. And before he came, he says, I visited my aunt and told her I'm going to Lethbridge for the 25th anniversary of the Nikka Yuko Garden. She says, you know, she says, I went to many places in 1967 to the, you know, because it's Canada's centennial. And she says, you know, one of the things that stands out in my memory is my visit to Lethbridge. And she says, you'll enjoy it. Well, he's a graduate of Queen's University in Canada. She is a graduate of, I forget what university in Britain. Both spoke eloquent English. And they came and they were just a wonderful, wonderful ambassadors. And we were so happy to have them because when he spoke without notes, and he spoke without any accent, and this, you know, oh, it was wonderful to have them. I try to tell them, look, there's more than just the aesthetic pleasure, but you're not going to get it in the first one visit. You have to keep coming back. And this is the advantage that local people have, is that they can come in many times they want during the summer. And each time, there's people who come in and they say, oh, I just stopped in for a short visit today. And you know, and it kind of refreshes them a little bit. I think that the whole garden is such that you don't see the whole thing at one time. One of the keys to a good Japanese garden is hide and reveal. And so as you walk along the stroll path, the view keeps changing, you know. And even as you're going back, it's kind of familiar, and yet you're seeing it from a different viewpoint. And so it seems like you're walking down a different path in the garden. And no, I don't know what else to say. It's just a relaxing place. You know, when I come in the gate and I get that feeling, and I see the pavilion, and the pavilion is the focal point of the garden. It's the raison d'etre for the garden. And I stand there and I look at it and I think, oh boy, this has got to be it. This has got to be it. I wish I lived here.